9 o'clock. Let's get started because we have, and I know people are logging in as we speak, but we have so much to get through in a tight half hour. So let's get started. For all of you who are on the call today, my name is Meredith Jacobs. I am the CEO of Jewish Women International, formerly editor-in-chief of the Washington Jewish Week, and welcome to Women on the Week, Roundtable Sharp Perspectives. I love that tagline. Thank you, Danielle Cantor, for coming up with it. This is basically a Jewish women's version of Meet My Press. If I could just ask as you log in, if you mute yourself. I'm going to briefly introduce our panel. I encourage all of you to go back and read their full bios. These women are phenomenal. And I deeply thank the Forward and JTA for coming on board to join with us and host this event every week. This is a soft launch, so we're testing it out, and then hopefully starting Friday, September 11th, we'll be coming to you weekly to unpack the news of the week and do a deep dive with a special guest on a particular topic. So just by way of introduction, Jody Rudderin is the editor-in-chief of The Forward. She previously served more than 2 decades as a reporter and editor of the New York Times. Laura Adkins is opinion editor of JTA and adjunct professor of journalism at Yeshiva University Stern College for Women. And Tema Smith, joining us from Ontario, Canada, is a diversity advocate, writer, and contributing columnist to the Jewish Daily Forward. She is also director of professional development at 18 Doors, previously known as Interfaith Family, and for the past 10 years has worked to advance the conversation on racially diverse Judaism. So welcome to all of you. I'm going to dive right in. Jody, starting with you. When you were at the Times, you served for a number of years as the Jerusalem bureau chief. You also covered the 2004 American presidential campaign. I want to look at the timing of back in January when Trump announced his Middle East peace plan. That was seen as really giving a lift to Netanyahu. I'm wondering if this recent UAE Israel plan is kind of Netanyahu returning the favor, especially, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that this is basically formalizing an already robust foreign relations program between the two countries. So I'd love your thoughts on it.
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you so much for putting this together so fast and so smartly. I love roundtable sharp perspectives also. Definitely not sharp elbows, right? So, it's interesting. I was on vacation last week when this news broke, and it was it really befuddled me. I don't want to suggest that it's not a really big deal. It is a really big deal, but I think you're right that actually on both sides of the deal, it seems to basically be formalizing and publicizing something that was essentially already true. UAE and Israel had all this sub rosa business and other things going on. It is a huge deal to make that public, but it is essentially publicizing and formalizing something that has been developing for years. And I really never thought Netanyahu was going to annex the West Bank. So I think it was also a political public formalizing of taking that off the table and removing it from the political debate. And while I think that, Trumpland definitely celebrated it, trumpeted it, made it a big deal, and I think, made it seem like your theory that this could be a gift back from Netanyahu or this was very good for the right in this country from the Republican Party, I really feel like it's the opposite. The vast majority of American Jews do not vote on Israel. There was a recent poll that was like the lowest issue for most Jews. Both campaigns seem to think there is a cadre of American Jews, particularly in Florida, for whom support pro-Israel support and Trump's, virulent pro-Israel support could make the difference. The reason most Jews don't vote on Israel is partly because there's for years been very little daylight between the parties on Israel. That has started to change, but with 2 things that happened recently, I think that between Biden and Trump specifically, it's back to the old way. And that those two things are, the DNC made the move to not include the word occupation in its platform. And now annexation is off the table. The biggest difference between Trump and Biden on Israel that could potentially lose Biden pro-Israel votes was that Biden was critical of the idea of annexing the West Bank. So there was this theory that there were these hard right pro-Israel, take the whole land folks in Florida who might vote for Trump because of that, because Biden would be out there on annexation. To me, that's now off the table. So yes, it was a moment where Trump gets to be like, I'm Israel's best friend. I helped broker this important deal. But now there's nothing to talk about Israel for the campaign, as far as I can see, because there's so little public difference between these positions.
Interesting. Laura, what are you seeing from JTA?
Yeah, I have a slightly different read on two things that Jody mentioned. Number one, we know that American Jews do not vote on Israel policy by and large as their top voting issue. But we also know that the vast majority of this country is not Jewish. Evangelicals are the biggest voting bloc in the United States. They're a force to be reckoned with, and they do vote on not necessarily Israel, but on issues for which mentioning Israel and biblical allusions is a signal that an individual is in line with evangelical conservative values. So I've written about this before, and many scholars have as well, but when Trump mentions Israel, and indeed I would say when most Democratic candidates mention Israel, they're not talking to us. we're a tiny group. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, especially when we're listening for the specific phraseology for how they discuss Israel or Jerusalem or different things like that. Number two, I don't know with occupation if we can really talk about it in such binary, Netanyahu is going to occupy the West Bank or not, because there's been de facto occupation of so much of the West Bank for so long. We can quibble about whether or not Netanyahu should be trusted more in English or in Hebrew when he talks about whether or not he's going to officially annex portions of the West Bank. But the vast majority of Palestinians live under some form of or another of Israeli control, whether that's simply, limiting where they can go and when, or when we look at Gaza, what goods come in or not even. So, the West Bank, portions of the West Bank may not be formally annexed, but nothing really changes from, him deciding that he's gonna trade annexation for this historic deal. And I think that giving either of them too much credit for changing things is exactly what they want, right? Like Jody said, this doesn't change much, although it is exciting that, Israelis will get to go to the UAE, and there are some American rabbis who are kind of building an organic Jewish community there. Maybe not organic, but building a Jewish community there. So I think that's exciting from kind of an economic and human-to-human perspective. But yeah, I think whenever a politician makes a big announcement, we should look at what they're trying to distract us from. So I think that's more the big question we should be asking right now.
And it's interesting that you both noted that talking about Israel is really a message to the evangelicals. I mean, we saw that earlier this week in Trump's rally in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, where he was noting how interesting it was that the evangelicals were more excited about when he moved the capital of Israel to Jerusalem than the Jews did. And I know even back in August of 2019, Ed Kilgore wrote in New York Magazine about that when Trump is talking about Jewish disloyalty to Israel, he's messaging to the evangelicals. So interesting that's what's happening. Laura,
Meredith, if I can jump in for just a sec.
Go ahead, please.
We'll get into this a little bit more when we talk about the DNC, but it was very interesting to me, particularly to hear Joe Biden, both in sort of the in the videos leading up to his speech and in his speech last night, certainly talking about faith super openly, super passionately, which I think is a little bit of a response to this question of what will the religious right do in this election. There have been for many years, since before the general in 16, people have been talking about the dilemma for evangelical voters who have lots of problems with Trump and yet also are, naturally more aligned with the Republican Party. I thought there was a very overt religiosity to the last night of the convention.
I do too. Let's jump now, just because again, I want to make sure we have time to really dive into Kamala's nomination. Let's turn now to the Democratic convention, which, I mean, just on a television entertainment perspective, I thought was beautifully and sensitively done. I think the team deserves an Emmy, and I think it's going to forever change the way we do conventions in a good way. But I also saw a lot of, they even did a close up of Biden holding his rosary at one point, I think in the kind of the introduction to who he is. I found in his acceptance speech, his talking about this battle between light and darkness over the soul of our nation felt Christian in a way that was more Tolkien or C.S. Lewis than the Bible. But it just, I wonder what's unique about the way this campaign, this election, this debate between good versus evil, to put it in really simple terms, is shaping up, that seems unlike any other presidential campaign that feels more based in policy. So whoever wants to take that, just what's happening with this election?
It's very interesting. It makes me think of, the first time we really saw evangelical Christians mobilize as a voting bloc was in the 1980s, the election of Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. And ironically, Jimmy Carter was the one that was actually an evangelical, but the New York Times has reported on this phenomenon in great depth, but basically this idea of having a moral majority of people who are rooted in conservative values, and this feeling of an ethic transcending actual policy really became a force to be reckoned with in American politics. Ronald Reagan was, I believe, a thrice divorced actor at the time, and he became this symbol for this dying ethic of conservative values. And I think when we are in incredibly emotionally charged times like we are right now, to quote the late great Maya Angelou, people don't remember what you said, they remember how you made them feel. So when we're dealing with, I don't know that so many people know the appropriate exact policy response to this pandemic. That's not what people are voting on necessarily right now. So when you can tap into the core of what grounds people and gets them through hard times, that's incredibly effective. Whether we want to be cynical about it and say it's a great political ploy, or whether we want to say it's just tapping into this incredibly emotionally charged moment that we're in as a civilization, I think there's something very real about Joe Biden, even when he makes huge mistakes. He gets in trouble when he pushes back and yells at constituents, or when he plagiarizes a speech that he enjoyed hearing, and forgets to attribute it and then gets very riled up. He is an emotional person who's been through incredible life experiences. And I think that's something right now that people connect to much more than, no one's reading the Democratic Party platform with a close eye to see whether specific terms are listed other than a select few. People are listening to how you make them feel when you talk to them. And I think that's something that, ironically, maybe Biden is doing more than Kamala Harris in this election. I say ironically only because, through our gendered lens of the world, women are the ones that are supposed to, cultivate people's emotional needs. So I really felt that, Kamala's speech at the DNC convention was really, rooted in this narrative of this is who we are as a nation. And then Biden is the one really pulling at people's kishkas and heartstrings to remind us this is how we feel as a nation.
That's the perfect segue. Tema, I really want to turn things to you now for we're going to begin our deep dive. Let's talk about Kamala's, not only her historic nomination, but what we know she's going to be facing when it comes to misogyny, racism. What is this going to be like? What have we learned from Hillary's campaign? I know there's this movement of we've got her back that feels very different. But let's talk about what it means for Kamala to be on this ticket.
Sure. I mean, there's obviously so much we can say and so little time to say it in. And I just want to talk a little bit, from the personal lens of this. I think, looking at some of the places that I know she's going to be hit hard on. She's a woman with no kids, in a blended family. She obviously is not white. She is Black and South Asian. So people are probably going to come after the fact that she wasn't necessarily raised Christian, though she clearly identifies as Christian now. We've already seen some conservative voices within the Jewish community, criticizing her husband for their interfaith marriage, and then other people within the Jewish community really celebrating this. And then, of course, there's all of the layers of, we've seen is she too angry, which of course is an anti-Black trope. Is she too emotional, which of course is an anti-woman trope. So basically, she's facing in many very similar ways to what Hillary Clinton had faced. Nothing that she does is going to satisfy people. And, there's a lot of people who, of course, are extremely excited about her nomination. I put myself in that camp. But, I think we're already seeing birtherism. And, I don't think it's an accident that in her speech, she mentioned what hospital she was born in Oakland. I'm actually surprised, and I say this sort of facetiously as a dual citizen of Canada, US, that people aren't coming after the fact that she spent her teen years in Montreal. Like, it's coming. I know it's coming. And so there's just so many angles that people are going to come at her from. And it's hard. I mean, as a woman, as a mixed race woman, as a woman who works on including interfaith families in the Jewish community, I will say it's painful to watch, but also like entirely expected. I can tell you what's going to pop up in the next, are we at 73 days now? 73 days. And I hate, what's that line that's now the line of the convention? It is what it is. And I don't know what else to say. I think that she does have the tenacity and temperament. She knows what's coming. And she is tough as anything. And, one thing that I just keep thinking of is, I think it was yesterday, James Comey tweeted out a picture of himself with a t-shirt about electing more women, or 2 days ago. And Hillary Clinton, of course, posted a meme of herself being like, really? And, so I think we're seeing this really interesting dynamic of also there being a heightened awareness after what happened with Hillary, of the gender dynamics at play at the same time as all of those gender dynamics are at play again.
It's interesting, something you said, and I noticed this too, throughout the convention where they were talking about she can take it. She's tough. And there was, earlier this week, there was a wonderful forum, GW's Institute for Data and Democracy, where they were talking about misogyny and women in politics and the really horrifying attacks they face and abuse they face, especially online, and how it's keeping women from running. And why is it that I think, disproportionately so, women have to have that steel to be able to handle those and it's not just that it's going to stay somewhere out on the internet. These are, what do we see, the judge who how many, last week, the week before, it's pandemic time, I can't even figure the days, whose son was murdered. You know, these attacks are very, very real threats, and what, I guess what I'm asking is, what do we do? You know, what do we do so that we're not preventing more phenomenal women from being able to step up to leadership? So,
well, at the risk of sounding Pollyanna-ish, I think, you know, one of the things that was really on display this week at the DNC was how much really changed in 2018 in terms of just the sheer number of women who ran. And as my colleague and friend Kate Zernike wrote about at the time in the New York Times, like really ran it in a different way. Real, you know, we just the sheer number of elected women in from all those congresswomen who were white at all those states of the union to people like Keisha Lance Bottoms, who, you know, we saw last night as the mayor of Atlanta. I thought it was really, I do think that it's not like those attacks don't still come every time, but it is really getting normalized. I mean, we had several women lose the Democratic race, you know, 5 women in the race. So I think that's really interesting. I also really want to pick up on something Tema said that I just don't think is getting enough attention, which is, so because we've got race, we've got gender, but I think it's really interesting that Kamala is a woman who doesn't have biological children, didn't get married until I think she was 50 or something like that, is in a blended family, is the child of a bitter divorce. There's a great story in the Times by Ellen Barry today about that. You know, now and then that family's, you know, that video of Ella Emhoff and Maya Harris and Maya Harris's daughter, whose name is escaping me right now, that introduced Kamala last night, was like totally tearjerker, but really interested in terms of like, who is Kamala Harris? She's the stepmom and the aunt and the profession, the fighter and all that. And then we also have Joe Biden's interesting family. It seems like all of his children have married Jews, which I was fascinated to see. And we have a story about today, but you know, this surprising situation of Bo's widow in a relationship with Hunter. I mean, there's a lot of like messy, real family stuff here to kind of entertain ourselves with, but also it's relatable, right? This is how American families are. But I really think this question of a woman who is not the mom, I noticed Keisha Lance Bottoms, one of the first things she said was, I'm a mother of 4. And that is a credible, you know, there is this kind of check on a lot of us of, well, do you also do that mom thing? And it's interesting that Kamala both doesn't have biological children, but clearly is a very engaged stepmom. Ella, I think, talked about the Sunday night dinners and all that. So I'm really interested to see how that plays out, because that's really relevant to professional women all over the place.
there is, it goes back to that, like, you know, the first lady cookie recipe contest, where they really were playing up. Even Cory Booker was talking about how Kamala found the time. And I do love that about her, quite honestly, to like help him make his lentils and cut the onions. And who did she teach how to make a tuna melt, you know, or a couple months ago. But I also know that women struggle with, I saw a debate online about, do you add in your professional bio that you're the mother of 2 children and a dog and a fish tank and you know what? So, but Tema, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, no, I just want to say, I think the other thing that's been really interesting to me is watching the way that they've tried to like really, really hard to show that Doug Emhoff's ex-wife is also a part of this family and that they have a great relationship. And I've been watching sort of her Twitter account, and it's like this, like, you know, Brady Bunch picture of the perfect blended family. And I'm like, I mean, awesome, but like, there's something very funny. But also, you know, I just want to say, like, for me, watching as a woman in my late 30s who does not have kids of my own, who, you know, is sort of the consummate sort of young professional, seeing somebody who, or I guess I'm not that young anymore. I don't know where the young professional line cuts off.
You're
anymore.
young.
You're young.
Yeah,
you
but I think they posted something about like, are you a young person? And it cut off at like a few years younger than me. And I was like, oh, I guess I don't count as a young professional anymore. Okay, cool. That's where we are. Anyhow, but seeing her and seeing like that, because it hasn't historically been the case where a woman who hasn't had a family and kids has any future in politics. Not that I want to go into politics, let me get that straight. That's not on my horizon. But just seeing that normalized in a different way has been like insanely meaningful.
Laura, I want to ask you about, there was an interesting op-ed in JTA by Alicia Chandler about when we grab on and go, yay, Doug is Jewish, and get excited about that, but yet how we still demonize interfaith families. And how is that dynamic? I mean, part of me is like, I can't wait for the Hanukkah party. You know, but what are you seeing when it comes to that debate in the Jewish community?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I definitely have the, I guess, privilege to sit in two different communities. In my personal life, I am deeply rooted in an Orthodox life where that's not actually a conversation, where there's that hypocrisy going on. And then in my professional life, I'm obviously deeply involved in the broader Jewish culture. So I think we all have a lot of very paradoxical things that we keep in our heads at the same time, always. And part of bringing them to the forefront is examining both what's wrong with those views, but also what we can learn from the fact that we have to hold them. I think for the vast majority of American Jews under 40, it's not even a conversation anymore. Interfaith families are just called families. Like, it's not, outside of the Orthodox world, most people are not really grappling with that anymore. Our parents are, but I think, we have this huge shift in American culture. I'm not going to ground it in religion because I don't think that's what it's about. We, came to this country as a very immigrant forward community. And for a long time in this country, we're not part of the dominant culture. And that keeps you together in your group. That makes particularism very important. And people my age don't have that experience of being Jewish in America. We also, we're past like Israel being this big exciting thing that just happened that like gave the Jews a safe place. We're safe here and we're American. And when you teach your children that American values are Jewish values, of course they're going to fall in love with and make families with people who also share their American values. So I think it's really an American story that it is so much a thing now that we have families like Doug and Kamala's family that are just like a normal family that happens to integrate all of these different cultures and religious experiences. And I think we need to examine, why in the Jewish community we hold, not saying they're wrong or right, but why we hold the particularist attitudes that we still do. It's not just interfaith marriage. It's, the way in which Israel has become such a center point of our culture and, something that you can't really have candid conversations about necessarily. There's a lot of aspects of this. It's not just interfaith families. So I think it's less about, we're excited about this good thing for the Jews, but we're also being hypocrites. And it's more about, what does it mean to be an American Jew who's a part of secular society?
Fascinating. Okay, we have 2 minutes left. I want to just do a quick roundtable shot of just last words, any thoughts for the upcoming week. And I love that one of our listeners asked if we could extend to an hour. So that's exciting that our first half hour kicked off so beautifully. And we'll see what we can do. But for today, we're going to wrap up at 9:30. Tema, let me start with you. Just any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I want to just echo everything Laura just said about the conversation about interfaith families in our Jewish community. I had the privilege of meeting Alicia Chandler at the URJ Biennial, and we had some really fascinating conversations. She's a real sort of force. And so if anyone hasn't read that article, I highly recommend it. But we are at a tipping point where, this isn't, normalizing interfaith families has happened de facto, but it hasn't necessarily happened on a communal level in the way that we'd like to see. And that, of course, I have to put in a plug for the work that I do. That's the work that I do. I work with Jewish organizations to move them along, because that is 72% of non-Orthodox marriages in the Jewish community since 2000. So super important. Have to sort of say that. And seeing also, it's not just Kamala and Doug, it's also Joe Biden's kids. And just, this is who's running for the presidency now. That, for me, as the child of intermarriage, is like huge and very exciting. So really watch for those notes as this goes through.
I was going to say, that sounds to me like a future column right there very quickly. And we'll be sharing links, all the links that Jody just shared, as well as links to Tema's work in 18 Doors and the op-ed at JTA. So we'll be following up. You'll be all receiving an email with those links. Laura, how about you?
Yeah, I think two things simultaneously. I think it's really important to be gentle with ourselves this week, because even normal things seem very difficult when all you have is your same routine that you've been doing for some of us since March. And also just kind of listening to the judgmental voices that pop up into our head when we're evaluating items on the news or candidates, and questioning them, not judging them. But as I was watching Kamala's speech again this morning, I was like, wow, I love her outfit, and she just looks so polished. And rather than being like, I can't believe I'm having such a sexist thought, it's like, I wonder how often I have that thought about a male politician, or it's okay to celebrate that she looks fabulous, and also like question the sexist parts of our culture that mean she's only successful because she looks that way. So I think just having a curiosity about us as we go through the world this week is important.
I love that. I did also think that burgundy color was gorgeous, but I did also think that Bernie looked terrific when they did that recap of the people who ran. I was like, his suit is fitting beautifully. It looks like he's lost weight. He looks good. So maybe it's just me being superficial.
But also, like, I'm gonna withhold my "who looked terrible" comments because they seem not in the spirit. But wasn't it interesting that Cory Booker wasn't wearing a tie? So I'm dissecting the men's outfits right here happening.
That's so funny. And Jody, on that, let me turn to you for our final thoughts of the week.
So, you mentioned that I covered the 2004 presidential campaign, and I have to say that, I learned a lot about what's broken in our political system then, and it's only gotten worse. And I do think that these virtual conventions, or at least the first one, seems radically better for the voter and consumer and probably the political reporter than the live one, which was incredibly boring and chaotic. And this is just much more interesting. It will be so interesting to see the Republican version of that next week. Laura, when you were talking earlier about the emotion of the convention, how it seems to be playing emotion and kind of a thematic message rather than policy. I mean, I actually think that's always been true of American politics. I think all elections have been decided basically on two issues. Do people feel good about the economy a couple weeks before election day or not? And do they like the guy? Do they admire the guy? I think that what's interesting now, our elections before very few of our elections, certainly in our lifetimes, have had really high stakes. This is really the first, when you're in Israel, you realize how high stake, how everyone feels the stakes of the election connected to their personal lives. And that's where we are now. So it's really interesting to see how those emotions play in that situation. The Democratic Convention was so focused on, I think, diversity, and was so effective at portraying that diversity. One of my favorite points was the elevator operator from the New York Times. I'm sure that's my own personal connection, but all sorts of regular people and so much diversity. So it's just so interesting to think about what will the emotional ticks or pillars or frame of the RNC be. And I was struck when Biden talked last night about the 3rd anniversary of Charlottesville, and starting with Jews will not replace us, and then going to very fine people on both sides. So that was for me a real turning point in terms of the emotional power of Trump's presidency. And it'll be interesting to see what his sort of both dog whistles and other more frontal frames are emotionally and otherwise. So I think that it's hard to imagine that there won't be a bigger contrast, I expect, between the two productions. And because it's so much, as you were saying earlier, Meredith, a kind of documentary production, it is all constructed. And I think we can therefore break it apart and really look at the differences of what the parties are offering.
Especially with the rumored guests for who'll be speaking are very different. It'll be interesting to watch. I'm worried it'll be horrifying to watch, but we'll see, and we'll unpack it in a few weeks. I want to thank Tema, Jody, Laura, thank you all for sharing your wisdom and your time. To everyone who's on both this Zoom call as well as watching us on Facebook, thank you. Again, we'll be following up with links. We'll see you Friday, September 11th. And thank you to The Forward and JTA for joining JWI in this series. So
thank you, Meredith, for making it happen.
Thank you. And Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Bye-bye.